Archaeologists found a 30,000-year-old skeleton missing a hand, cleanly removed, and the bone had healed. Someone survived a full limb amputation with Stone Age tools. No anesthesia, no antibiotics, nothing but fire and whatever someone else knew how to do with a sharp rock. So how did people survive surgery before medicine even existed? The answer is stranger and more impressive than you'd think. Let's go back to the beginning, because survival without medicine wasn't luck. It was a system built over thousands of years, and it worked far more often than it should have. Start with the basics: cuts and wounds. To us, a deep cut means a hospital visit. To your ancestors, it meant something much simpler and much more dangerous: infection. There were no antibiotics, no sterile bandages, nothing that could kill bacteria on command. So they improvised. Researchers studying traditional healing practices across Africa, South America, and Asia have found the same plants used again and again for wound care: yarrow, plantain leaf, certain tree resins. Many of these plants actually contain natural antimicrobial compounds. Yarrow alone has been shown to slow bleeding and reduce infection risk. Your ancestors didn't know the chemistry, they just knew it worked, because the people who used it lived, and the people who didn't often didn't. But infection wasn't the only threat. Broken bones were a death sentence in almost every other species on Earth. A wolf with a broken leg starves. A bird with a broken wing gets eaten. But archaeologists have found something remarkable in human remains going back over 100,000 years: healed fractures. Not just any fractures, badly broken bones that took months to mend, which means someone was being fed, protected, and cared for the entire time they couldn't hunt or gather for themselves. This is some of the oldest evidence we have of compassion as a survival strategy. A 2014 study on Homo erectus remains found a skeleton with a healed thigh fracture so severe the individual couldn't have walked for weeks. They survived anyway, which means someone else kept them alive. Setting the bone itself was crude but surprisingly effective. Splints made from bark and bound with plant fiber or animal sinew have shown up at sites across multiple continents. The principle is identical to what doctors use today: immobilize the bone, keep it straight, wait. The technology was primitive, the understanding of anatomy was not. Now here's where it gets stranger: childbirth. For most of human history, this was the single most dangerous event a woman would ever face. No epidurals, no C-sections, no monitoring equipment, just instinct, experience, and other women. Anthropologists studying hunter-gatherer societies have documented something called assisted birth, a practice almost unique to humans among primates. Most animals give birth alone. Humans almost never did. Older women in the group, often grandmothers, acted as the first midwives in history, using pressure, positioning, and herbal remedies to ease labor and manage complications. Some plants used by traditional birth attendants, like raspberry leaf, are still recommended by some midwives today. The knowledge wasn't written down. It was passed mouth to mouth, mother to daughter, for thousands of generations, and it's the reason humanity didn't die out the first time a baby came out wrong. And then there's the part that sounds almost unbelievable: brain surgery. The technical term is trepanation, cutting or scraping a hole into the human skull, and it is one of the oldest surgical procedures we know of. Skulls with trepanation holes have been found on every inhabited continent, some dating back over 7,000 years. Here's the part that should stop you. Many of these skulls show clear signs of bone regrowth around the hole, which means the patient didn't just survive the surgery, they lived for years afterward. Researchers studying trepanated skulls from Peru found survival rates that in some samples exceeded 80%. For comparison, soldiers undergoing skull surgery during the American Civil War, thousands of years later, with steel tools, had a survival rate under 50%. Somehow, with stone tools and zero understanding of germs, ancient healers were doing this procedure better than 19th century battlefield doctors. Nobody is entirely sure why they did it. Some researchers think it treated head trauma, relieving pressure from skull fractures. Others believe it had a spiritual purpose, releasing evil spirits or curing seizures. Most likely it was both: practical medicine wrapped in a belief system, because for your ancestors, the body and the spirit weren't separate things to be treated differently. That blending of the physical and the spiritual shows up everywhere in ancient medicine. Healers, often called shamans by anthropologists, served as doctor, therapist, and priest all at once. They built enormous mental libraries of which plants helped and which plants killed, knowledge gained through generations of trial and error, much of it paid for in lives. Modern pharmacology has confirmed a surprising number of these ancient remedies. Willow bark, chewed for pain relief for thousands of years, contains the same compound found in aspirin. Mold, applied to wounds in multiple ancient cultures, contains the same antibacterial properties later isolated as penicillin.
Your ancestors didn't have microscopes. They had patterns, repeated over thousands of years, refined by the simple, brutal fact that mistakes got people killed. Pain itself had its own toolkit. Without anything close to modern painkillers, your ancestors still found ways to dull agony enough to function, and sometimes enough to survive surgery wide awake. Willow bark wasn't the only plant doing heavy lifting. Poppy use for pain relief dates back at least 5,000 years in the Mediterranean, and traces of opium residue have been found in pottery from ancient Cyprus. In colder climates without access to those plants, healers use something almost shockingly modern: cold. Packing a wound or an injured limb in snow or cold water to numb the area before cutting or setting a bone. The exact same principle behind the ice packs in your freezer right now. Alcohol fermented from grain, fruit, or honey shows up across nearly every ancient culture, and while nobody was citing clinical trials, the sedative effect was obvious enough that it became the default before any procedure that was going to hurt. Dental problems were handled with a brutality that would make you wince. Skeletons going back over 14,000 years show clear evidence of dental drilling, tiny, precise holes bored into teeth using bow drills tipped with flint, almost certainly to remove decay and relieve the kind of pain that, untreated, can spread infection into the jaw and bloodstream. There was no numbing agent. There was a person holding you down, a sharp tool, and the simple fact that the pain of drilling was less than the pain of leaving it alone. Disease that you couldn't cut out or splint required a different kind of knowledge entirely, recognizing what was contagious before anyone had ever heard the word germ. Across wildly different cultures with no contact with each other, the same instinct shows up again and again: isolation. Communities separated the sick from the healthy, sometimes moving an entire group away from someone showing symptoms, sometimes building separate huts at the edge of camp specifically for illness. They didn't know about bacteria or viruses. They knew that sickness spread from person to person, and that distance slowed it down. That observation, made by people with no microscopes and no germ theory, is the same principle hospitals still use today when they put a contagious patient in isolation. It took thousands of years of watching people get sick after contact with other sick people to arrive at a rule that simple, and once a group learned it, that knowledge became one of the most valuable things they owned. And mistakes were constant. This is the part we don't like to think about. For every field fracture, there were dozens that never set right. For every successful birth, there were mothers and infants who didn't survive. For every trepanated skull with smooth bone regrowth, there's a skull with no healing at all, meaning the patient died on the table or shortly after. Life expectancy at birth for most of human history hovered somewhere between 25 and 35 years, and a huge part of that number is dragged down by childhood mortality and death in childbirth. If you made it past age 15, your odds got dramatically better, but the margin for error in everyday life was razor thin. A simple infection, untreated, could kill a healthy adult in under a week. So how did the species survive at all? The answer is the same one that shows up again and again when you study your ancestors: community. No single person needed to know everything. Knowledge was distributed. The person who knew which plant stopped bleeding wasn't necessarily the person who knew how to set a bone, and groups that pooled that knowledge outlived groups that didn't. Medicine, before medicine existed, wasn't an individual skill. It was a collective memory, carried by elders, tested by necessity, and passed down because the alternative was extinction. You live in a world where a sore throat means a pharmacy run, and a broken arm means a same-day cast. That convenience is so total, you've probably never once had to wonder if a cut on your hand might be the thing that ends your life. But for over 99% of human history, every single one of your ancestors carried that calculation, every day, with no exception. And somehow, using nothing but plants, fire, observation, and each other, enough of them survived long enough to make you possible. The hospital didn't save your species. Your ancestors did that themselves, centuries before anyone wrote down the word medicine.